after the high stakes Oval Office summit debacle, much has happened.
Lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
While the urge to get online and comment on the significance of this diplomatic blunder was overwhelming, I feel like I did well to resist joining the bandwagon, at least with the benefit of hindsight. The seemingly irreparable relationship has come back from the brink. The US and Ukraine in unison extended an unconditional ceasefire deal to Russia on March 11th, which was countered as to only pausing aerial attacks on energy infrastructure on March 18th by Russia, which Ukraine also agreed to, but then there came other conditions from Putin. To his credit, President Trump truly wants an end to this war. But blanket ceasefire that Trump wants seems to be narrowing down after each shuttle diplomacy by his envoy. Shuttle diplomacy is a strategy of traveling or calling back and forth by an intermediary, like the US, when the direct talks between the two enemies is impossible. With one eye on the flailing ceasefire talks, let's talk about the relationship between the US and Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, but has been central to shaping the transatlantic relationship between the US and its NATO allies. Let's examine why the onus of protecting Ukraine from Russia has been falling upon the US, a country geographically so far away from the region.
And that this war is far more important to Europe than it is to us, and that there's a very big, beautiful ocean, a separation. This is, we're helping Europe, we're trying to help.
But the war got to the US when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. In today's interconnected world, it is easy to see how the US could be dragged into another war, where conflicts can erupt in space and even cyberspace more often than in the physical world. The dressing down Zelensky received at the White House was actually helpful in rallying support in Ukraine. A poll conducted by Ipsos in Ukraine found that 70% approve of Zelensky's leadership on the war effort. Almost 80% of them consider him a legitimate president. 74% favor continuing the war efforts without even American support. And almost 60% of Ukrainians believe they can still win against Russia. Interestingly, a similar shift in public sentiment has also played out in Canada, where the Liberal Party was behind on every poll not that long ago. But its popularity has so far risen after taking a firm stand against Donald Trump's imperial rhetoric. If only this shift in popularity happened in the US. The origin of the US-Ukraine relationship is rooted in the Cold War. But this video is not attempting a full-blown Cold War rundown. That's been done to exhaustion by countless historians and documentarians. But briefly, very briefly, the Cold War was a decades-long ideological chess match between the US and the Soviet Union, where global influence was the prize and nuclear annihilation the ultimate stakes. What began as a tense geopolitical standoff after World War II ended with the Soviet Union's spectacular collapse in 1991. Now, let's get to Helsinki Accords. The Helsinki Declaration was a major diplomatic agreement signed during the height of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union-led Warsaw Pact countries. Signed by US President Gerald Ford and Soviet Union leader Leonid Brezhnev, alongside 33 other countries in Europe and North America on August 1 of 1975. Helsinki Accords, in essence, was a pact among their signatories to recognize member nations' sovereignty, the freedom to choose foreign policy, to respect human rights, and religious freedom of all their citizens, including the minorities. And most importantly, in this context, they all agreed to not forcefully take territories from other countries. Each participant country publicized this pact domestically, ushering in a new era for human rights advocacy across Eastern Europe. While this was not a binding treaty like the Article 5 of NATO, this international agreement, backed by the United States, mind you, played a crucial role in Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union. The Helsinki Accords emphasized on political self-determination, freedom of speech, and territorial integrity. All of this became central to the Ukrainian independence movement and gradually eroded the legitimacy of the Soviet Union due to its human rights abuses. Later, through a national referendum on December 1, 1991, Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union, with over 84% of eligible voters participating and an overwhelming 90% voting in favor. Democracy in Ukraine had truly come to fruition, whose seed was sown back in Helsinki in 1975, nurtured by the West and the US. However, these fundamental principles of self-determination, the right to choose one's foreign policy, and adherence to human rights were once again trampled by Russia when Putin's army rolled across the Ukrainian border with tanks in February of 2022, just as they had in Crimea back in the spring of 2014. The United States emerged as the primary architect and moral backbone of the Helsinki Accords, leading the challenge against Soviet human rights abuses and championing the principles of national sovereignty through the rest of the Cold War. By spearheading this international effort, the US positioned itself as the global guardian of democratic ideals, an identity that would define its foreign policy and pave the way for future commitments, such as the Budapest Memorandum. Before getting into Budapest Memorandum, I want to set the scene. After the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Eastern Europe experienced massive instability. Instability would be an understatement. Ukraine was no exception. On top of that, the nuclear weapons that the Soviets had developed were now falling into newly formed countries which were going through their own internal power struggle. Specifically, after the Soviet Union was dissolved, Ukraine inherited approximately 1900 strategic nuclear warheads, making it the third largest nuclear arsenal globally at that time, after the US and Russia. This arsenal included 130 SS-19 and 46 SS-24 ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, along with 33 heavy bombers, totaling around one-third of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons. The total yield of these weapons was estimated at 360 megatons. Think of it as 25,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. There were real concerns in the Western world and Russia that those weapons of mass destruction could fall into the wrong hands amidst all the internal power struggle and chaos. To alleviate those fears, the US took the lead in securing an agreement under which Ukraine, alongside Belarus and Kazakhstan, would give up its inherited nuclear stockpile to Russia. In return, these nations would receive economic compensation as well as security assurances from the US, the UK, and Russia. I will note that the Budapest Memorandum, signed on December 5, 1994, was not a legally binding treaty, but rather a diplomatic document offering security assurances. Crucially, while it promised protection, the wording was deliberately crafted to avoid committing signatories to a mutual defense pact like the NATO. This meant that if Ukraine's sovereignty was threatened, the US and the UK were not automatically obligated to intervene militarily. Russia, one of the three guarantors of this agreement, went on to violate the memorandum multiple times, most notably with the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The US, UK, and other European countries upheld the security assurances by providing financial and logistical support to Ukraine, but they refrained from direct military involvement to prevent the conflict from escalating into global war from a regional one. And yet, the Budapest Memorandum achieved one of its primary goals, reducing the overall number of nuclear weapons in the world. Much of the highly enriched uranium from Ukraine's nuclear arsenal was repurposed into low-enriched uranium for use in nuclear power plants. This disarmament of Ukraine played a critical role in global non-proliferation efforts, with over 600 nuclear warheads removed from Ukraine by 1996. Given the promises made under the Budapest Memorandum, where the US effectively urged Ukraine to surrender what could have been a powerful deterrent against future aggression, Washington's financial and logistical support for Ukraine today is not just a moral and ethical obligation, but also a political one. Now, in the wake of the leaders of US blaming Ukraine for getting invaded, the credibility of international security agreements has been deeply shaken. Many countries may now reconsider the nuclear ambitions, questioning whether the US-led security umbrella can truly be relied upon. To maintain global stability, it is paramount that the US honors the commitments made by previous generations of American leadership. Because when a nation signs an international agreement, it is not merely a contract with a single administration. It is a promise made by the entire nation. Now, let's talk about more recent stuff. I say recent, but it's again 11 years old. The Euromaidan protests of 2014, when Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych abandoned a crucial EU association agreement to cozy up to Russia in 2013, hundreds of thousands of grassroots Ukrainians took to Kiev's Independence Square, fighting not just for political change, but for the fundamental right to choose their own destiny. The fallout from this was explosive. Yanukovych fled to Russia, and Russia's response was swift and brutal, labeling the protest as CIA-backed and annexing Crimea while fueling separatist movements in eastern Ukraine. For the US, this wasn't just another foreign policy challenge, it was a moment of reckoning. Washington shifted its approach to Ukraine from diplomatic nicety to strategic imperative, recognizing that supporting Ukraine meant defending the very principles of sovereignty and democratic self-determination. Euromaidan wasn't just a protest, it was a turning point that would set the stage for everything that followed, including the massive support during the ongoing full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was where the US drew the line on the sand, declaring that some principles are worth fighting for, even when that happens thousands of miles away. See, these historical contexts are not just random details. These are extremely important to understand the world we live in. The world order that the US has built upon its own terms has kept the world away from the Third World War for 80 years now. The US has also managed to squeeze in few but major transgressions here and there with impunity, largely because it has been a single most powerful nation in what used to be a unipolar world since the fall of Soviet Union in 1991. But we're now living in a multipolar world, with NATO unsure about its own alliance and with China threatening the US's military supremacy. And now, thanks to the Trump administration's protectionist and imperialist tendencies, diplomatic supremacy is also in jeopardy. The might is right philosophy is harmful for the US itself, especially when you're using that tactic against your allies, against whom you naturally have higher leverage because of your codependencies. Your rivals, on the other hand, have never relied on you. So flexing your muscle against the likes of China and Russia does not work as well as you might think. If the US is just another superpower with the might is right attitude, then what makes America a more lucrative partner than China or even Russia? Multiple reports suggest that China is well placed and already making inroads in places the USAID was just removed from. You may think, with this military might, why does the US need allies? But the ground realities were different. American power projection is dependent on allied help, be it through the intelligence gathered through the Five Eyes or spy network alliance with Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, or through the Ramstein Air Base in Germany and Pine Gap signals in Australia, or through missile tracking system in Canadian Arctic. The same alliance that has been the strength of the US could turn out to become our weakness if those ties are severed, because the US is not prepared for that kind of world, while China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran together are. Now let's see what is going on with the peace talks. On March 11th, after the US and Ukraine put forth the ceasefire proposal to Russia, Russian President Vladimir Putin very typically put a counter-offer, one where both sides would only stop attacking each other's energy infrastructure, an area where Ukraine has been landing mighty blows on its invader. But on March 19th, Ukrainian President Zelensky agreed to pausing attacks at energy infrastructure. On March 24th, a narrow proposal for a ceasefire at Black Sea, a narrow waterway between Moscow and Kiev, was agreed upon. On March 28th, Putin has demanded North Korea, alongside BRICS members, also be part of peace talks, while also asking for President Zelensky, who has a wide support from the people of Ukraine, to be replaced by a UN-sanctioned government. These demands are not signs of a man who wants to compromise. According to multiple reports, Russia has also lost a lot in this war. The war has cost more human lives in Russia than in Ukraine, while the entire Russian economy is now geared to this war. Reports estimate a loss of 150,000 to 210,000 soldiers on the Russian side, while capturing roughly 11% of Ukrainian territory since 2022. By all measures, the war has been a massive blunder on the Kremlin's part so far, and hence the invasion is reportedly widely unpopular in Russia, while Ukraine and Ukrainians seem more resolved in their defense. Given the situation, Putin, now 72 years old, may be looking at this war through a now or never prism. And Trump's well-documented admiration of authoritarian leaders might just be the lifeline for Putin's dream of greater Russia. The narrative coming out of the Kremlin warns the peace talk could drag into 2026. It's only April of 2025 right now. By Trump's own admission, Russians are dragging their feet. To be fair, even Ukraine's leadership will not want a peace deal that might be unpopular back home, like conceding all territories and a pledge to never join NATO, which is why it is vital in this moment for the US to stand by its ally. No, not Russia, Ukraine. But I do not hold much optimism. During an interview with Tucker Carlson, America's top negotiator Steve Witkoff was unable to name 3 of the 5 occupied regions in Ukraine that Russia claims.
First of all, I think the largest issue in that conflict are these so-called 4 regions: Donbass, Crimea, the names Lugansk, and there's 2 others.
The same territories that he's eager to concede to Russians on behalf of Ukrainians, while reciting Russian propaganda talking points.
They're Russian-speaking.
Yep.
There have been referendums where the overwhelming majority of the people have indicated that they want to be under Russian rule.
Speaking in sycophantic rhetoric towards Trump on behalf of Putin. A couple of weeks ago, there were reports that top US diplomats also met with the opposition leaders in what some speculate could be an effort to undermine President Zelensky. With a friend like this, who needs an enemy?
A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast.
Helping Ukraine is not an act of charity for the US. It is actually self-serving. Hey, but do not take my word for it. President Trump's own Secretary of State in 2022 famously called for the US to stand by Ukraine, saying, quote, "The world will become a very scary place if we allow thugs like Putin to invade sovereign nations without severe consequence. We must be clear and unyielding in our support for the Ukrainian people's fight against merciless." I agree with you, Marco Rubio. The irony is striking. The US is now negotiating yet another security agreement for Ukraine, despite being unwilling to uphold previous such agreements. Depending on how it pans out, we will be doing a deep dive on the events of these peace talks in a few weeks to few months' time. This is a reminder to consider subscribing and turning on notifications to be the first in the know. See, Trump does not have much interest in the context or history of any diplomatic relationship. See this.
But during 2014, nobody stopped him. He just occupied and took. He killed people. You know what the contact?
2015.
2014.
2014 to 2014.
Yeah. So
I was
killed.
not here.
Yeah, but
Right or wrong, for him, this is all very personal. If the US of the present day does not follow through on the promises made by the US from yesterday, and as the trend would go, the US of tomorrow never strives to keep the words that the US utters today, then American credibility in global security agreements is permanently damaged. Such an inconsistent foreign policy is unprecedented and frankly unacceptable. Then, the cost the US and the entire world might have to pay for the wars that could follow will far exceed any funding that the US is currently supplying to NATO or Ukraine, because that cost would not just be the US greenback but also American lives. Because I hate to say it, but Mr. President,
You're gambling with World War III.
hey, quickly, foreign policy aside, President Trump is about to announce more and more tariffs against friends and foes alike. We did a deep dive to understand how dangerous tariffs can be. Click on this link to see how he is reading the history wrong to use tariff as an economic tool.